The cabin door hung open. Inside, breakfast sat on the table, biscuits still warm enough to soften butter. 6 plates, 6 chairs. A child's rag doll lay face down near the hearth. On the eastern wall, above the water bucket, someone had pressed their palm flat against the raw wood and left behind a print so dark with blood it looked like rust eating through the grain. The Mercer family, Daniel, age 34, his wife Margaret, 31, and their 4 children ranging from 2 to 12 years old, had walked into the Kentucky hills 3 months earlier with a wagon, 2 mules, and a land deed purchased for $14 from a county clerk who wouldn't meet Daniel's eyes. By September of 1879, the cabin they'd built stood empty. The family had vanished, not fled, not packed, vanished. And that handprint spoke a language the hills had been speaking for generations, a language most people refused to learn until it was far too late. Daniel Mercer heard about the land in a Cincinnati boarding house from a man who called himself a land agent but smelled like corn whiskey and failure. The year was 1879, spring cutting through the Ohio River Valley, with rain that turned streets to mud and made sleeping 4 to a room feel like drowning. Daniel had come north from Virginia after the war, worked timber mills, lost 2 fingers to a saw blade, married Margaret Ashford in 1867, and fathered 4 children in quick succession. John, the eldest, was 12, Sarah, 9. The twins, Emma and Samuel, had just turned 2. Margaret did washing for boarders. Daniel took whatever work his damaged hand could manage. They were drowning in a different way, the slow suffocation of poverty that makes men listen to land agents in dim hallways. Kentucky Hill Country, the agent said, spreading a crude map across a table sticky with spilled beer. Uncleared, unclaimed, 200 acres for $14 cash. Government land that nobody wants because it's steep. But steep don't matter if you're willing to work. The map showed a parcel in what would later be designated as Harlan County, though in 1879 the boundaries were still fluid, counties bleeding into one another across ridgelines that had no English names yet, only Cherokee words slowly being forgotten. The land sat in a hollow called Bone Fork, though the agent didn't mention that name. He said it was near a creek, good water, timber for building, soil that would take corn if you terraced it right. "Why so cheap?" Margaret asked when Daniel brought the map home. She was nursing Samuel, her dress stained with milk and ash from the fire. "Nothing's that cheap unless there's a reason." Daniel spread the map on their narrow bed. "He says squatters kept moving off, said the land's cursed or some such nonsense. Mountain people are superstitious, we're not." But Margaret had grown up in the Virginia Piedmont, daughter of a Baptist preacher who'd lost his church for speaking against slavery. She knew how men package lies. "What did the clerk say when you bought the deed?" "He asked if I was sure. Twice." "And you said?" "I said we're sure." The deed arrived by post 3 weeks later, hand-lettered on parchment that had been folded and refolded until the creases threatened to tear through the ink. Legal description: Southeast Quarter, Section 18, Township 27, Range 8. Bone Fork Watershed. No improvements. No warranty of title. "No warranty," Margaret repeated, holding the parchment to lamplight. "That means if someone else claims it, we lose it." "Nobody's claiming land nobody wants," Daniel said. But his voice carried the edge of a man trying to convince himself. They left Cincinnati on June 3, 1879. Everything they owned fit in a borrowed wagon pulled by 2 mules Daniel purchased from a farmer for $30. money borrowed from Margaret's brother with a promise to repay within 2 years. John walked alongside the wagon. Sarah rode in back with the twins, singing songs their grandmother had taught them. Margaret kept a journal, though entries were sparse, practical observations written in pencil on the backs of old invoices. June 9th, passed through Lexington, children well, mules stubborn. June 14th, roads deteriorate south of Crab Orchard, John's boot sole separated, repaired with wire. June 21st, entered hill country. Trees so thick you lose the sun by 3 o'clock. Daniel says 2 more days. They never reached the land on June 23rd as planned. The route the agent had sketched bore no relation to actual terrain. Roads became paths. Paths became suggestions. Suggestions vanished into laurel thickets that required machetes to penetrate. They climbed ridges only to discover the hollows on the other side were impassable. It took them until July 2nd to find Bone Fork. The first thing Margaret noticed was the silence. Not peaceful quiet, but the absence of sound that should have been there. No bird song, no insect hum. Just the creek moving over stones with a whisper that sounded almost like breathing. Bone Fork Hollow ran northeast to southwest, narrow and steep-sided, barely 300 yards wide at its broadest point. The creek that gave the fork its water ran clear but strangely cold, even in July heat. Oak and poplar trees rose so thick that standing at the hollow floor, you couldn't see the ridgetops. The undergrowth was dense laurel and rhododendron, green walls that closed off sightlines to 30 feet in any direction. Daniel walked the property boundaries with a compass and the legal description, trying to match abstract survey lines to actual landscape. "It's all here," he called back to Margaret. 200 acres, mostly timbered. Creek water, building sites, even some flat ground for corn. What he didn't mention was the other thing he'd found. A stone foundation, barely visible under leaf, litter and moss, marking where a cabin had once stood. The stones were blackened on the inner faces. Fire. And near the foundation, he'd kicked up something that made him look away quickly. Small bones, too small to be animal, arranged in a pattern he didn't want to interpret. He covered them again with leaves and said nothing. They chose a building site 40 yards from the creek, on a shelf of level ground backed against a limestone outcrop that would serve as a north wall and windbreak. Daniel felled trees with a borrowed axe. John helped, learning to swing, to notch, to judge the fall. They skidded logs with the mules, trimmed them, and began stacking. By mid-July, they had walls rising. By August, they had a roof of split shingles. By late August, they had a door, a hearth, and a chimney cobbled from creek stones and red clay. Margaret planted a kitchen garden in the small cleared space. Beans, squash, potatoes. She hung their clothes on a line strung between 2 trees. She taught Sarah to churn butter from the milk of a cow they'd traded a mule for. A desperate trade, but the terrain was too steep for plowing, and they needed the milk more than the hauling power. The twins toddled in the yard, playing with sticks and stones, speaking to each other in the private language twins sometimes develop. On September 7th, Daniel walked 6 miles down Bone Fork to the nearest settlement, a cluster of cabins around a crossroads store. The storekeeper, a man named Jasper Colwell, watched Daniel approach with an expression that might have been pity or might have been something colder. "You the one bought the Bone Fork parcel," Colwell said, not a question. "Daniel Mercer. Moved my family up 3 months back. Come to purchase supplies." Colwell scratched something in a ledger. "You'll want flour, salt, maybe lamp oil. What else?" Daniel listed his needs. Colwell filled them slowly, methodically, packing everything into a burlap sack. When Daniel reached for his coin purse, Caldwell waved him off. "Pay me next time. You'll need that money for other things." "I pay my debts." "I know you do, but you'll need money soon enough." The way he said it made Daniel's chest tighten. "What aren't you telling me?" Caldwell tied off the sack and pushed it across the counter. "I'm telling you that 7 families have tried to settle Bone Fork in the last 20 years. None of them made it through a winter. Most didn't make it through fall. Why? Depends on who you ask. Some say the land's bad. Some say there's something in the hills that don't want people there. Me, I don't speculate. I just know facts. And the fact is, 7 families went in, and 7 families came out missing pieces, or didn't come out at all." Daniel felt the weight of the sack in his hands. "What kind of pieces?" "The kind that make you wish you'd listened when the clerk asked if you were sure." He carried the supplies back up the hollow as daylight bled out of the sky, and with every step the trees seemed to lean closer, and the silence seemed to press harder. And he thought about those small bones arranged in a pattern and wondered what he'd brought his family into. Margaret was hanging laundry on September 10th when she heard a voice calling from the tree line. She turned, clothespin in her mouth, and saw a man emerge from the laurel thicket like something conjured from shadow. He was old, maybe 70, dressed in homespun trousers and a shirt gone gray with age. His beard reached his chest. His eyes were the color of flint. "Morning, ma'am. Name's Josiah Pridemore. Elder at the church down at the crossroads. Heard you folks had settled Bone Fork." Margaret removed the clothespin. "Margaret Mercer. My husband's cutting timber up the ridge. Can I help you?" Pridemore stepped into the clearing but came no closer than 20 feet. "Come to welcome you proper, and to share a word of counsel if you'll hear it." "I'll hear counsel, though I can't promise we'll take it." "Fair enough." Pridemore leaned against a hickory tree, his weight settling like a man preparing for a long conversation. "You know the history of this hollow? We know it's cheap land that nobody wanted. There's a reason for that. Goes back before the war. Cherokee people had a name for this hollow. Translated rough, it means where the bone grows. They didn't settle it, didn't hunt it, left it alone because they said the land was hungry." Margaret felt a chill despite the September warmth. "Hungry for what?" "Blood, some say. Others say it's not hunger so much as punishment. There was a massacre here long time back. White settlers ambushed a Cherokee hunting party, killed 11 men and left them where they fell. After that, the Cherokee avoided this place, said the dead were angry and the land had turned against all people, red or white." "Old stories," Margaret said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Old stories with new proof. Like I said, 7 families have tried settling here since 1859. First was the Hardings, family of 4, found their cabin empty one October morning. Food on the table, fire still warm, but the family gone. Never found a trace. Second family was the Drummonds, husband, wife, 3 children. They lasted 2 months. Neighbors went to check on them after smoke stopped rising from their chimney. Found the place torn apart like something had come through in a rage. Blood on the walls, but no bodies. I can give you details on all 7 if you want, but the pattern's the same. Families go in, families disappear or come out broken, and each time, there's always one detail that don't make sense. A handprint, a message scratched in the floor. Something that suggests the people knew what was coming and tried to leave a warning." Margaret crossed her arms. "If this land's so dangerous, why does the county keep selling it? County needs money, and there's always people desperate enough to take a risk. Like yourselves, I'm guessing. He said it without malice, just weary recognition. I'm not here to judge. I'm here to offer a way out. My church has a fund. We can buy your deed for what you paid, $14, and help you relocate to land that won't kill you. We're not leaving. Daniel's voice came from behind her. He'd emerged from the tree line carrying an axe, his face set in the expression Margaret knew well. The stubborn mask he wore when he'd already made a decision and wouldn't be moved. We've got 3 months' work into this place. We're not abandoning it because of ghost stories. Pridemore pushed off from the tree. Then I'll pray for you, and I'll ask you to do one thing. If you see something wrong, and you will, don't hesitate. Don't try to understand it. Just take your family and run. He walked back into the laurel without waiting for a response, and within seconds the green had swallowed him so completely, it was like he'd never been there at all. That night, Margaret wrote in her journal, September 10th. Elder Pridemore came. Warned us about the land. Daniel refuses to leave. I understand why. We have nowhere else to go. But I'm afraid in a way I've never been before. The children sense it. Sarah asked me 3 times today if we're safe. I lied and said yes. God forgive me. Daniel found the first sign on September 14th. He was clearing brush near the old foundation he'd discovered, thinking maybe they could use those stones for something useful. A root cellar, a smokehouse. He scraped away decades of leaf litter and exposed the full foundation, roughly 20 feet by 16 feet. The stones fitted without mortar in the old way. And in the center, where a hearth would have been, he found charred wood and something else. Bones. Dozens of them. Small, delicate, arranged in a spiral pattern that radiated from a central point. Animal bones, he told himself. Rabbit, squirrel, possum. But some were too uniform, too carefully placed. And at the center of the spiral, scratched into a flat stone, were symbols that looked almost like letters but weren't any alphabet Daniel recognized. He covered it again, told himself it was nothing. Old Cherokee burial customs, maybe. Nothing to do with them. But that night he couldn't sleep, and when he finally dozed off near dawn, he dreamed of hands pressing against the cabin walls from the inside, trying to push through, and woke with his heart hammering. Margaret found the second sign on September 16th. She was washing clothes in the creek, the twins playing on the bank nearby, when she noticed something odd about the water. It was running clear, as always, but caught on a submerged branch was a piece of cloth. She pulled it free and held it to the light. A child's dress, faded but intact, made from calico printed with tiny roses. She looked up and down the creek, saw nothing else. But when she turned back to the twins, Samuel was pointing at the tree line. Man, he said. His vocabulary was limited, but his tone was certain. Man watching. Margaret scanned the laurel thicket, saw nothing but green shadow. There's no man, sweetie. Come away from the water. But Samuel kept pointing, and his face held an expression Margaret had never seen on a 2-year-old. Not fear exactly, but recognition. Like he'd seen this man before and knew what it meant. That evening, Daniel walked the boundary again with his compass, trying to map the exact property lines. He needed to know where their land ended and the wider wilderness began. Needed some sense of control. As dusk thickened, he found himself in the northeast corner, where the hollow narrowed and the ridge walls steepened, and scratched into a beech tree at eye level were words carved deep enough that time hadn't erased them. Leave while you can. J.H., 1862. 17 years old. The Hardings, the first family, the ones who'd left food on the table. Daniel traced the letters with his finger. The carving was deliberate, each letter carefully formed despite what must have been desperate haste. J.H. John Harding? James? And why carve a warning into a tree on the property boundary, where only future settlers would find it? Unless he'd been trying to mark something, or unless he'd been running and stopped here to leave a message before. Daniel didn't finish the thought. He walked back to the cabin as night fell, and he didn't tell Margaret what he'd found. On September 19th, Margaret walked down to the Crossroads store. She told Daniel she needed thread for mending. Really, she needed information. Needed to know what Jasper Colwell hadn't said. The store was a single room with a pot-belly stove, shelves of dry goods, and a counter scarred by decades of transactions. Colwell was measuring nails from a barrel when Margaret entered. He looked up, nodded, finished counting. "Mrs. Mercer, what can I help you with?" "Thread, dark blue if you have it." He found a spool and set it on the counter. "Anything else?" "Information," Margaret said. "You told my husband 7 families tried to settle Bone Fork. I want the details." Colwell's expression didn't change. "Why?" "Because we're living there. Because I have 4 children sleeping in a cabin where other children slept and then vanished. I need to know what we're facing." He considered this. Finally nodded. "Fair enough. You're paying with more than money if you're staying in that hollow. Least I can do is tell you what I know." He pulled out a ledger from beneath the counter, opened it, flipped back through pages until he found what he was looking for. "Keep my own records. Started in 1859 when I opened this store. Here's what I wrote. Harding family. Moved to Bone Fork, July 1862. Family of 4. John, his wife Ann, 2 sons ages 8 and 6. Found the cabin empty October 9th. Neighbors went to check because smoke had stopped. Found breakfast laid out, all 4 beds made, clothes folded, door open, no sign of struggle except a single bloody handprint on the wall above the water bucket. Search parties found nothing. Property abandoned. Drummond family. Moved in spring of 1864. William and Catherine Drummond, 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, ages ranging from 4 to 10. Lasted until August. Neighbors heard screaming one night, but didn't investigate until morning. Found the cabin destroyed. Furniture overturned, walls gouged like something with claws had been trying to get out, or in. Blood spatter across the floor and walls. No bodies. Property abandoned. Margaret felt her throat constrict. And the others? Colwell continued reading. Tucker family, 1867. Simmons family, 1869. Both lasted less than 3 months. Both vanished without clear trace. Then the Calloway family in 1871. Father was found alive but insane, wandering 3 miles down the hollow, speaking in a language nobody recognized. Wife and children gone. He died 2 days later without regaining his senses. Pritchard family, 1874. Parents and an infant. The infant was found in the cabin, alive but malnourished. Parents gone. Baby was adopted by a family in Harlan. Child grew up with no memory of what happened, but refused to speak until he was 7 years old. Last family was the Cooks, 1877. They lasted the longest, nearly 5 months. Then one morning, the father, Ray Cook, walked into this store covered in scratches, his clothes torn, his eyes wild. Said his wife and 3 children were dead. Said he'd killed them himself, but couldn't remember doing it. Said something in the hollow had gotten into his head and made him do it. He was arrested, tried, hanged in 1878. Silence filled the store like water rising. "Did anyone ever investigate?" Margaret asked. "Law, government, anyone?" "Sheriff rode up there twice. Found nothing but empty cabins. No bodies, no evidence of foul play beyond the blood. Eventually he stopped investigating. Said Bone Fork was cursed, and people needed to stop trying to settle it. But the county kept selling the deed, because land is land and money's money." "Did Cook say anything specific? About what was in his head?" Caldwell closed the ledger. He said it felt like someone was standing behind him all the time, even when he was alone. Said he'd hear breathing that wasn't his. And right before it happened, before he killed his family, he said he finally turned around and saw what had been standing there. But when they asked him what it was, he couldn't answer. Just said it wasn't something that should exist. Margaret bought the thread and walked back up the hollow as afternoon light slanted through the trees. She tried to tell herself that Cook had been insane, that grief and isolation had broken him. But she couldn't shake the image of a man turning around and seeing something that shouldn't exist, something that had been standing behind him all along. Sarah started playing a new game on September 22nd. Margaret noticed her in the yard with the twins, crouched in a circle drawn in the dirt. They were placing stones in a pattern, a spiral radiating from a central point. "What are you playing?" Margaret asked. Sarah looked up, her 9-year-old face serious. "The teaching game." "Who taught you that?" "The girl." Margaret felt her pulse spike. "What girl?" "The one in the trees. She comes when Papa's gone. She watches us, but she doesn't talk. Just shows us things." "What does she look like?" "She's wearing a dress with roses, and her hands are red. The dress from the creek, the bloody handprint on the wall." Margaret swept the stones away with her foot. "I don't want you playing that game anymore. And if you see this girl again, you come get me immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mama." But Sarah's eyes held something older than 9 years, like she understood more than she was saying. Like she knew Mama couldn't protect them from what was coming. That night, Margaret sat Daniel down and told him everything. The bones at the foundation, the dress in the creek, the girl Sarah had seen, the spiral pattern the children had been making. He listened without interrupting, his face growing paler with each detail. "We need to leave," Margaret said. "Tonight. We pack what we can carry, and we walk out of this hollow in the dark. We don't wait for morning." "And go where? We have no money, no home, nowhere to go. Everything we have is in this cabin. Everything we have means nothing if we're dead." Daniel gripped her hands. His own were shaking. "One more week. I'll finish clearing the north section. We can sell the timber, get enough money to relocate properly. 1 week. We don't have a week. Then we'll be fast. We'll be vigilant. We'll keep the children close. But we can't run with nothing. We won't survive that either." Margaret wanted to scream that they wouldn't survive this, that money and timber meant nothing against whatever was in these hills. But she looked at her husband's face and saw the desperation there, the stubborn refusal to admit that they'd made a terrible mistake. And she loved him enough to give him 1 week, even though she knew, with the certainty that mothers sometimes have, that it was already too late. September 24th. Daniel and John spent the day felling timber in the north section. Margaret kept Sarah and the twins inside, doors barred, even though the September day was warm enough that the cabin grew stifling. She spent the time mending clothes and trying not to think about the story Caldwell had told. The girl in the tree line, the spiral of bones. Around 3 o'clock, while the twins napped and Sarah read from the only book they owned, a water-damaged copy of Pilgrim's Progress, Margaret heard something, a sound from within the walls. Not scratching, not tapping, breathing. Slow, rhythmic, like someone sleeping, or like something that had been asleep for a long time and was beginning to wake. She pressed her ear to the wall. The breathing continued, so faint she couldn't be certain it was real. Maybe it was just wind through cracks in the chinking. Maybe it was her imagination, paranoia turning ordinary sounds into threat. Then she felt the wall move. Just slightly, barely perceptible but unmistakable. Like something on the other side had shifted position. Like something was pressed against the wood, listening just as she was listening, separated by only 6 inches of oak planks. She stepped back. Sarah looked up from her book. "Mama? What's wrong?" "Nothing. Stay with the twins." Margaret went outside, circled the cabin, examined the walls. Saw nothing unusual. The logs were tight, the chinking solid. No gaps big enough for anything larger than a mouse. And yet she'd felt something. Something alive. When Daniel and John returned at dusk, she told Daniel what she'd heard. He checked the walls himself, found nothing, attributed it to wind or settling timber. But that night, lying in their bed with the children sleeping in the loft above, Margaret heard it again. Breathing, within the walls. And this time Daniel heard it too. He sat up, lit a candle, examined the wall beside their bed, put his hand flat against the wood, felt the faint, rhythmic movement. He looked at Margaret, his face drained of color. "Tomorrow," he whispered. "We leave tomorrow. First light." But they wouldn't make it to first light. September 25th. The day Daniel Mercer had promised would be their last in Bone Fork. They spent the afternoon packing what little they could carry. Margaret folded clothes, wrapped food in cloth, tried to decide which possessions meant survival and which were just weight. Daniel fashioned packs from canvas and rope. John gathered tools. Sarah helped with the twins, keeping them calm, singing songs, being the brave older sister. By sunset, everything was ready. They would sleep a few hours, then leave at 3 in the morning when the moon would be high enough to light the path down the hollow. 6 miles to the crossroads. Safety, distance, life. They ate a cold supper. No fire, no smoke, nothing to signal their presence. Put the children to bed early. Daniel and Margaret sat at the table holding hands, not speaking, listening to the cabin settle around them, listening to the breathing in the walls that had grown louder, more insistent. 10 o'clock. Daniel checked the door for the 3rd time, made sure the bar was secure, checked the windows, small openings covered with oiled paper that let in light, but nothing else. Everything was locked. Everything was tight. "Try to sleep," he told Margaret. "We need strength for the walk." They lay down, but didn't undress, kept their boots on, lay on top of the blankets with their arms around each other, listening to their children breathe in the loft above, listening to the thing in the walls breathe below. 11:15. Margaret was drifting into an exhausted sleep when she heard John's voice from the loft, urgent and afraid. "Pa! Something's outside!" Daniel was up instantly, grabbing the rifle he'd kept loaded beside the bed. "What did you see?" "Movement in the tree line. Shapes. Lots of them." Daniel moved to the window, peeled back the oiled paper, looked out into moonlit clearing, saw nothing at first, then saw everything. Figures stood at the edge of the trees, Not hiding, not moving, just standing. He counted 6, 7, 10 more. They were barely visible in the darkness, but moonlight caught them in fragments. A pale hand, a face too gaunt, clothing from another era, and they were all watching the cabin with an attention that felt like weight. "Get the children down," Daniel said quietly. "Pack in hand. We're leaving now." Margaret climbed into the loft, woke the twins gently, brought them down. Sarah followed, clutching her book. John descended last, carrying the packs. They gathered in the center of the cabin, Daniel still watching the window, rifle ready. "Are they coming closer?" Margaret whispered. "Not yet, but I count at least 15. More in the shadows, maybe." "Who are they?" "I don't know." But he did know, or suspected. The families who'd come before, the Hardings, the Drummonds, the Calloway wife and children, all the others who'd vanished into Bone Fork and never left. Returned now for reasons Daniel didn't want to imagine. He made his decision. "We're going out the back. There's a gap in the tree line on the southeast side. We run for that, we follow the creek down. Don't stop for anything." "What about the supplies?" "Leave them. Just take the children." He moved to the back wall, the one with the limestone outcrop pressed against it. No door here, but he'd built a small hatch for ventilation, barely 2 feet square. He unbarred it, pushed it open. Darkness and cold air poured in. Margaret goes first with Samuel, then Sarah with Emma. John follows. I'll come last. Margaret kissed him once, quickly, then squeezed through the hatch with Samuel in her arms. Dropped to the ground outside. Sarah followed with Emma. John went next, his lanky 12-year-old frame barely fitting through the opening. Daniel took one last look around the cabin they'd built with their own hands. Saw the breakfast dishes still on the table, the clothes hanging on pegs, the doll on the hearth, their life reduced to abandoned objects. Then he heard the breathing in the walls change, no longer slow and rhythmic, now urgent, excited. And he heard footsteps above him, in the loft, where no one was. He squeezed through the hatch, dropped to the ground, pulled it shut behind him. Margaret and the children were already moving toward the tree line. Daniel ran after them, rifle in one hand, trying to keep his family in sight as they plunged into the laurel thicket that marked the southeast boundary. Behind them, the cabin door splintered open, and the sob things that had been standing in the clearing began to move. The laurel was so thick it scraped skin. Margaret pushed through with Samuel clutched to her chest, the 2-year-old mercifully silent, understanding on some primal level that noise meant death. Sarah came behind her, pulling Emma by the hand. John followed, then Daniel bringing up the rear, rifle ready but useless. He couldn't see more than 10 feet in the darkness, couldn't identify what was chasing them, only heard the footsteps behind them multiplying, closing the distance. They broke free of the laurel and hit the creek. Margaret's boots splashed into water cold enough to shock the breath from her lungs. She waded downstream, stones slick under her feet, the twins heavy in her arms. Behind her, she heard Sarah gasp as she stumbled, heard John catch her before she went under. "Keep moving!" Daniel's voice, harsh with fear. "Don't stop!" But stopping wasn't the problem. Direction was. The hollow was dark as a coffin, moonlight blocked by the tree canopy. The creek twisted and split, offering false paths that might lead to safety, or might lead deeper into the maze of ridges and laurel hells that filled these hills. Margaret chose a fork at random, waded up it, felt the water deepen to her knees, her thighs, behind them splashing. Not footsteps now, something else. Something moving through water with more than 2 legs, more than 4. Something that shouldn't exist, but did, drawn by blood and fear and the particular resonance of a family trying to escape. "Papa!" Sarah's scream cut through the night. "It's got John!" Daniel spun, saw his son 20 feet back, half submerged, arms flailing, being pulled under by something he couldn't see. Daniel didn't think. He lunged back, grabbed John's wrist, pulled, met resistance, pulled harder, felt John's coat tear, felt his son come free with a wet, ripping sound that would haunt Daniel for however many minutes he had left to live. John surfaced, gasping, his face white with terror. "Something grabbed me, something cold. It was—" He couldn't finish. "Move!" Daniel shoved his son forward. "Go, go, go!" They ran. Not waited now. Ran, churning through the creek, breaking through to the bank when the water grew too deep, crashing through underbrush, veering away from the sounds of pursuit. The hollow had become a living thing, closing around them, narrowing the spaces between trees, thickening the laurel, removing the gaps they needed to escape through. Margaret burst into a small clearing and stopped so suddenly that Sarah collided with her back. Ahead, blocking the path, stood the girl from the tree line, the one Sarah had seen. She wore a dress printed with roses, faded and water-stained. Her hands were dark with something that looked black in the moonlight, but wasn't. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "Go around," Daniel said, but there was no around. The clearing was, ringed with laurel so thick it formed a wall. And now, emerging from that wall, came others. The figures from the cabin. Men, women, children, all wearing clothes from different eras, all bearing the wounds that had killed them. A woman with her throat opened. A man with half his skull caved in. A child with fingers bent at wrong angles. The Mercer family huddled together in the center of the clearing. Daniel raised the rifle, knowing it was useless, knowing you can't shoot ghosts or memories or whatever these things were. But he had to do something. Had to die protecting his family, even if protection was impossible. "Please," Margaret said, and she was talking to the figures, talking to the dead. "We're leaving. We'll never come back. We'll tell everyone Bone Fork is forbidden. Just let us go." The girl in the rose print dress tilted her head, opened her mouth, and spoke in a voice like wind through dry leaves. "You fed the hollow. Now the hollow feeds." The figures closed the circle. Daniel kept the rifle aimed, finger on the trigger, but his hands shook so badly he couldn't have hit anything even if bullets mattered. Beside him, Margaret pulled the children closer. Sarah and the twins pressed against her, John standing beside his father, trying to be brave, trying to be the man he'd almost become. The girl spoke again. Same wind voice, same 2 old words from a 2 young mouth. 7 families came. 7 families fed us. You are the 8th. The hollow is almost full. Full of what? Daniel heard himself ask, and hated how weak his voice sounded. Bone grows here. Blood makes it grow. When the pattern is complete, we can leave. We can go back, but not before. Margaret's mind, sharpened by terror into a clarity she'd never known, latched onto those words. You're trapped here. Whatever you are, you can't leave either. The girl's face, if it was a face, shifted, almost smiled. The land binds all who bleed on it. Cherokee blood first, white blood after. We are the price of massacre. We are the echo of what was done, and we will feed until the debt is paid. Then take me. The words came out of Margaret's mouth before she'd consciously decided to say them. I'll stay. I'll feed your hollow or pattern or whatever you need, but let my family go. Maggie, no! Daniel grabbed her arm. Let them go, she repeated, louder. 4 children who've done nothing wrong. A husband who was desperate and foolish, but not evil. Take me. I'll be your 7th family, your final blood. Just let them walk out of here. The figures in the circle looked at each other, if looking was what they did. Some communication passed between them, wordless, ancient. The girl spoke. One may leave. The others stay. You choose which. Margaret's heart, already racing, seemed to stop entirely. That wasn't the offer. That is the only offer. Choose now. What would you do? If the dead gave you this choice, save one child or lose them all, which mathematics of horror would you accept? Margaret stood in that clearing with Daniel's hand on her shoulder, and her children pressed against her legs, and tried to think like a mother, like a human being, like anything except the animal her mind was becoming. I can't, she whispered. Then we choose. The girl's voice had lost its wind quality, had become something sharper, more final. We choose the smallest, the ones who won't remember, the twins. No! Margaret's scream echoed through the hollow, bounced off the ridge walls, came back as mockery. No, you can't. They're babies. They don't even understand. That is why we choose them. Memory is the cruelest burden. We are merciful. The figures moved, faster than anything that dead should move. They flowed across the clearing like water, like smoke, like hunger given form. Daniel raised the rifle, fired. The shot echoed uselessly, the bullet passing through nothing and striking a tree. Margaret clutched the twins, tried to shield them with her body. But hands, if they were hands, pulled Samuel and Emma from her arms with strength that couldn't be resisted. Mama! Emma's scream. Samuel's wail. The sounds children make when they don't understand why they're being taken. When they only know that Mama always kept them safe before and now Mama can't. Daniel lunged forward. Something struck him, a force without source, and he fell, his head cracking against a stone. John ran toward his siblings. Sarah grabbed his coat, held him back, her 9-year-old grip somehow stronger than her 12-year-old brother's fury. And Margaret watched as the figures carried her twins toward the tree line, toward the laurel wall, toward the breathing darkness of Bonefork. Emma's rag doll fell from the child's grip, landed in the dirt, lay there like a small corpse itself. Then they were gone. The figures, the twins, everything. The clearing emptied so suddenly it was like waking from a nightmare. Except the nightmare continued, because Daniel was bleeding from a head wound, and Sarah was sobbing, and John was screaming words no child should know, and Margaret. Margaret stood perfectly still, not breathing, not thinking, already gone in the way that mothers go when the worst thing happens, and there's no coming back. The girl in the rose print dress remained. She picked up the fallen doll, held it out to Margaret. You can leave now. Take your 3. The hollow is satisfied. Margaret took the doll, felt its fabric body, still warm from Emma's hands. Wanted to tear the girl apart. Wanted to burn the entire hollow. Wanted to die right here, right now, rather than walk out of these hills knowing she'd failed in the only job that mattered. But she had 3 more children. 3 who were alive and could still be saved. Mama, Sarah's small voice. We have to go. Margaret looked at her daughter, saw herself in that face. The same dark eyes, same stubborn chin. Saw what Sarah would become if they survived this. Strong, ruthless maybe, definitely broken, but alive. She nodded. They walked out of the clearing, leaving the hollow behind. Margaret didn't remember most of the walk out. Later, when people asked, She would say the path appeared before them, lit by some force that wanted them gone more than dead. The laurel parted. The creek ran straight. The hollow released them because it had taken what it wanted and had no use for what remained. Daniel walked in front, his head wound bleeding but not fatal. John followed, then Sarah. Margaret came last, clutching the doll, looking back every 10 steps to make sure this wasn't another trick, another false promise. They reached the crossroads just before dawn. Jasper Colwell's store was dark, but a lamp burned in the room above it where he lived. Daniel pounded on the door until the storekeeper appeared, holding a shotgun and a suspicious expression that dissolved when he saw the Mercer family. 3 of them present, 2 absent, all of them wearing the same hollow-eyed look he'd seen on Ray Cook's face 2 years earlier. "Dear God," Colwell breathed. "Come inside." He made coffee, wrapped Daniel's head, gave the children bread and butter. Didn't ask questions until Margaret began talking on her own, the words spilling out in a monotone that suggested her mind had separated from her mouth and was somewhere else entirely. She told him everything. The cabin, the breathing walls, the figures in the clearing, the choice she'd been given, the choice that was no choice at all. Colwell listened without interrupting. When she finished, he poured more coffee and said, "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't bring them back." "No, but maybe this does." He went to a cabinet, pulled out a worn ledger, opened it to a page near the back. "I kept records of all 7 families, what happened to them, what they lost, and I found a pattern." He showed Margaret the page. 7 entries, 7 families, each one losing people, but not all. The Hardings, 2 children gone, parents survived but left the area. The Drummonds, 3 children gone, parents found dead. The Tuckers, wife and son gone, husband survived but died in an asylum. The pattern continued, each family losing some but not all, each surviving member departing and never speaking of what happened. "Why?" Margaret asked. "Because the hollow needs blood, but it needs witnesses more. It needs people to leave, to tell stories, to warn others, and then watch as desperate families ignore those warnings and enter anyway. It's a trap that resets itself, an engine that runs on hope and grief." "Then we break it," Margaret said. Her voice had changed. The grief was still there, but underneath it was something harder, colder. "We make sure no one else enters Bone Fork, ever." "How?" "We go to the county. We tell them to condemn the land, make it legally forbidden. And if they won't do that," she looked at Daniel, "we do it ourselves." They tried legal channels first. Margaret and Daniel went to the county courthouse in Manchester on September 28, 1879. Told the county clerk the full story. Showed the bloody dress Margaret had pulled from the creek. Showed the symbols Daniel had sketched from the stone at the foundation. Demanded that Bone Fork be condemned, withdrawn from sale, marked as dangerous land. The clerk listened with the expression of a man who'd heard this before. When they finished, he pulled out a file. "You're the 8th family. I have documentation here from the previous 7, all requesting the same thing. The county's position is that we have no legal grounds to condemn land based on supernatural claims. If you want Bone Fork declared unsafe, you need physical evidence of danger, unstable ground, contaminated water, something measurable." "2 of our children are gone," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "That's measurable. Your children are missing. You have no proof of what happened to them. No bodies, no witnesses beyond yourselves. For all the county knows, you abandoned them or worse." Margaret slapped the clerk so hard his spectacles fell off. Two deputies moved to restrain her. Daniel stepped between them and his wife, hands raised. "We're leaving," he said. "But understand this. If another family enters that hollow and loses children because you kept selling that cursed land, their blood is on your hands." The clerk put his spectacles back on. "The county has a duty to generate revenue from all available land. Bone Fork is available land. That's all the law cares about." They left the courthouse understanding that the law would not help them, which meant they would have to help themselves. On October 1st, 1879, Daniel Mercer and 3 men from the Crossroads settlement entered Bone Fork carrying kerosene, matches, and a rage that had been building for 5 days. They went to the cabin the Mercer family had built, set fire to it, watched it burn until nothing remained but charred logs and ash. Then they moved systematically through the hollow, burning everything that could burn. The old foundation with its spiral of bones, the trees where symbols had been carved, the laurel thickets where figures had stood watching. They poured kerosene on the forest floor and lit it, creating a fire that would burn for 3 days, that would send smoke visible from 20 miles away, that would sterilize that land so thoroughly that nothing would grow there for decades. The sheriff came, arrested Daniel and his companions for destruction of property, for arson, for a dozen charges that carried years in prison. But at the trial in November, Jasper Colwell testified about the 7 families. Elder Pridemore testified about the Cherokee history. Margaret testified about her children, holding Emma's rag doll, her voice never rising above a whisper, but carrying enough weight to fill the courtroom. The judge dismissed the charges, ordered the county to remove Bone Fork from sale, declared the land condemned due to unspecified hazards to public safety. And in a move that was never officially recorded, but was understood by everyone present, he ordered the county to erect a stone marker at the hollow entrance, a marker that read, "Bone Fork Hollow, forbidden ground, enter at your own peril." The marker stood for 70 years. Eventually, vandals knocked it down. Eventually, trees grew back over the burned ground. Eventually, the hollow became just another nameless fold in the Kentucky hills, indistinguishable from 1,000 others. But the people who lived near it remembered, and they taught their children. And the children taught their children. And for 5 generations, no one entered Bone Fork. Until 1949, when 2 hikers ignored the stories. Only one of them came out. The Mercer family left Kentucky in November of 1879. They traveled north to Ohio, then west to Indiana, finally settling in a small farming community outside of Terre Haute, where no one knew their story. Daniel found work at a grain mill. Margaret took in sewing. They raised their 3 surviving children in a house they bought with money borrowed from a church fund. They never spoke about Bone Fork. Not to each other, not to their children, not to anyone. John eventually married, had children of his own, died in 1933 without ever mentioning his younger siblings. Sarah became a teacher, never married, died in 1947 having told no one about the night she watched her baby brother and sister taken by things that shouldn't exist. Margaret lived until 1928. Near the end, when morphine had loosened the locks she'd put on her memory, she told a nurse about the twins, about the choice she'd been given, about the doll she'd kept for 49 years, hidden in a trunk in her attic, because throwing it away felt like killing them twice, and keeping it felt like penance. The nurse wrote it down. Her notes eventually made their way into a folklore collection compiled by a professor at Indiana University. The story was filed under Appalachian death legends and forgotten, but the hollow didn't forget. In 1949, 2 hikers, college students from Lexington, entered Bone Fork despite warnings from locals. They were looking for adventure, for a taste of the wild before settling into office jobs and mortgages. One of them kept a journal. The last entry, dated September 7th, 1949, read, "Found an old foundation. Bones arranged in a spiral. Heard something breathing in the trees. Tom says we should leave. I want to explore more. We'll update tomorrow." There was no tomorrow. Tom staggered out of the hollow 3 days later, incoherent, his face bearing scratches that looked like small hands had raked across his skin. His friend's body was never found. Tom spent 6 months in a psychiatric facility. When he was finally released, he refused to speak about what happened. He died by suicide in 1952, leaving a note that said only, "It's still standing behind me." Bone Fork entered the 20th century quietly. The fire Daniel Mercer set in 1879 had sterilized the ground, but eventually nature reclaimed it. Trees grew. Laurel filled in. The hollow became indistinguishable from any other fold in the Kentucky mountains. Hikers occasionally entered. Most left without incident. A few didn't. In 1973, a family of 4, parents and 2 children, went missing while camping in the area. Search parties found their tent, their supplies, even their car. But the family had vanished. Local authorities initially suspected kidnapping. Eventually, the case went cold, filed under unsolved disappearances. In 1988, a real estate developer bought a large tract of land that included Bone Fork, planning to build vacation cabins for tourists seeking Appalachian authenticity. Construction crews entered the hollow in June. By July, they'd all quit, citing wrong feelings and bad vibes. 2 workers claimed they'd seen children in old-fashioned clothes watching from the tree line. The project was abandoned. The land was sold at a loss. In 2003, a paranormal investigation team entered Bone Fork with cameras, recording equipment, and the arrogant certainty that everything could be explained by science or psychology. They documented strange sounds, cold spots, equipment malfunctions. One investigator filmed something, a figure in a rose print dress standing in the trees. The footage was analyzed, debated, eventually dismissed as either a hoax or a trick of light. None of the investigators mentioned that their team of 5 had left as a team of 4, that the missing member, a woman named Jennifer Hale, had simply walked into the laurel and never returned, that her disappearance was explained away as her choosing to quit the team mid-investigation, an explanation everyone accepted because the alternative was too disturbing to acknowledge. Today, Bone Fork remains. It has no official name on modern maps, just an unnamed hollow in Harlan County, Kentucky, one of hundreds in a region that guards its secrets behind walls of laurel and histories too dark to teach in schools. If you know where to look, you can find the old marker, toppled and moss-covered, but still legible. Forbidden ground. No one lives there. The county maintains its condemnation order, updated every few decades by clerks who don't know why, but follow the protocol because it's in the records. Occasionally, hikers enter, drawn by the mystery or the challenge or simple ignorance. Most leave, some don't. The pattern continues. The hollow feeds. Not annually, not even regularly, just often enough to maintain itself. Enough blood to keep the debt unpaid, enough witnesses to keep the stories alive, enough mystery to draw the next desperate family or curious adventurer. Because that's what Bone Fork is, ultimately. Not a place, but a mechanism. Not haunted so much as designed. The Cherokee understood this. They'd built it deliberately, or so the oldest stories claim. created a space where the murdered could hunt the murderers, where the debt of massacre could be collected in perpetuity, where the land itself became a mouth that swallowed those who ignored its warnings. Whether that's true or whether Bone Fork is simply a hollow where tragedy compounds itself, where fear and isolation break people in predictable ways, where coincidence and folklore merge into legend. That's the question historians and folklorists still debate. But the families who lost people there don't debate. They know. Margaret Mercer knew. She carried that knowledge like a stone in her chest for 49 years, and it killed her as surely as if the hollow had taken her instead of the twins. She understood, in the end, that the choice the hollow gave her was no choice at all, that refusing to choose would have meant losing everyone, that choosing meant becoming the kind of mother who ranks her children by who's worth saving. She chose, and it destroyed her. And the hollow fed on that destruction as much as it fed on the blood of Samuel and Emma Mercer, who were 2 years old when they vanished into the laurel and never emerged. The doll Margaret carried for 49 years, Emma's rag doll with button eyes and a dress sewn from flour sacks, was buried with her in 1928. For decades, it lay silent in the dark of her coffin. Then, in 2016, the cemetery where Margaret was buried flooded during a spring storm. Some graves shifted, some coffins broke open. When workers were cleaning up the damage, they found a doll washed up against a headstone, a rag doll with button eyes and a dress made from flour sacks. They threw it away. It was just trash, just flood debris. 2 days later, a maintenance worker at the cemetery reported seeing a little girl in the graveyard at dawn. She was maybe 2 years old, wearing clothes from another century, wandering between the headstones like she was looking for something she'd lost. When he approached to help, she vanished. Some debts never clear, some hollows never empty, and some families never stop feeding the land that took their children, no matter how many generations pass, or how far they run, or how desperately they try to forget. The Bone Fork Hollow waits. It has nothing but time. And eventually, someone will enter again. Out of ignorance or desperation, or the simple human certainty that stories from 1879 can't possibly be true in the modern world. The hollow will be ready. It's always ready. In 2023, a graduate student researching Appalachian folklore found Margaret Mercer's testimony in the Indiana University archives. She included it in her dissertation on collective trauma narratives in post-Civil War Kentucky. The dissertation noted that while the Bone Fork story couldn't be verified through official records, no death certificates existed for the twins. No property records confirmed the Mercer family's ownership. The story persisted across multiple source texts spanning 14 decades, suggesting either a shared traumatic event or a particularly resilient urban legend. The student didn't enter Bone Fork to investigate. She was studying folklore, not risking her life. But she noted in a footnote that her dissertation committee asked her to remove, but she kept anyway, that she'd driven past the hollow entrance in October of 2022, had seen the fallen marker, had felt an overwhelming urge to walk up into those trees, to see for herself what all the stories were about. She'd resisted the urge, taken photos from the road, left. That night, in her hotel room, she'd reviewed the photos on her camera and noticed something in the background of one image. A figure standing in the tree line, barely visible in the shadows. Small, child-sized, wearing a dress that might have been printed with roses, though the resolution made it impossible to be certain. She deleted the photo, didn't mention it in her dissertation. Graduated, took a teaching position in Pennsylvania, and never returned to Kentucky. But sometimes, late at night, she dreams of a little girl with a rag doll, standing at the edge of a laurel thicket, waiting for someone to come play. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.